The envelope had sat on Loretta's kitchen counter for weeks. Pale cream with thick, bold letters spelling out the invitation, Cedarwood High 15-year reunion. She stared at it as if it were something she didn't understand, though she could read perfectly well. Even now, she felt a strange tension in her chest as the memories crept back like old scars that had never healed but simply stopped hurting. Loretta, once the top student, the golden girl everyone expected to shine, had never been one for reunions. She'd left Cedarwood High like a bird fleeing a cage. She had dreams bigger than that small town could hold. Every teacher, every friend, every acquaintance had poured their expectations into her. Her parents, the neighbors, the church congregation, they all spoke of her in hushed tones, pride and envy wrapped up in equal measure. Asterisk, that girl's gonna make it. She's bound for something great, asterisk. But instead of the path they all imagined for her, she'd found herself standing behind a counter at a diner on the outskirts of town. Her apron wrapped around her waist, her hands rough from cleaning and serving, she still held her head high, but something had shifted. Years had passed in the mundane rhythm of life, tip jars, rent, and the sweet comfort of simple things. The letter, though, pulled at her. And more than the words on it, it was the thought of walking back into that room filled with the faces of people who once knew her when she had been something else, someone else. She fingered the edge of the envelope now, contemplating if she should go. It wasn't that she felt shame, though sometimes, late at night, that sharp sting would come, but rather, a deep, quiet acceptance of the way life had unfolded for her. Still, there was a question lingering, unspoken, like dust settling in the corner of her mind. What would they see when they looked at her now? She had seen them, the others. A few came through the diner now and then. Melanie Walsh, the girl who'd been voted most likely to marry rich, had breezed through with her pearls and her polished smile, now a realtor in town. Eric Johnson, who once never showed up for class on time, had inherited his father's hardware store and expanded it. Everyone seemed to have found their place in the world, even if it was in that very town. Loretta couldn't help but wonder if maybe she'd let herself down, somehow. The day of the reunion arrived like a quiet storm. Loretta had convinced herself not to care, but her hands betrayed her, trembling slightly as she fastened her earrings. She slipped into a plain, yet well-tailored dress, nothing flashy, nothing like the girl she used to be. Her reflection in the mirror seemed distant. She still held that same fire behind her eyes, but now it was tempered with something else, something softer. The reunion was being held at the old community hall. The place hadn't changed much, except maybe the faces on the wall, photographs of generations who had passed through Cedarwood High. Loretta parked her car, and for a moment, she just sat there, staring at the brightly lit building. She could hear faint music, the distant murmur of voices. As she walked inside, she felt that familiar mix of curiosity and apprehension rise in her chest. The room was filled with laughter, conversations layered on top of each other. She recognized so many of the faces, older, maybe softer in some ways, but still carrying the same glimmers of the teenagers they had been. No one noticed her at first, which was a relief. She drifted along the edges of the room, collecting snippets of conversation, watching as people clung to their groups. They laughed easily, leaned into one another, as though the 15 years had been a breeze. Loretta's heart quickened when she saw familiar figures moving toward her, faces lighting up with recognition. She braced herself. "Loretta?" A smile tugged at her lips as she turned, but there was something in her eyes, something hidden just beneath the surface. "Loretta? Is that really you?" It was Melanie Walsh, now Melanie Price, if Loretta remembered correctly. Her hair was still blonde and polished, a shade too perfect to be natural. She looked just as Loretta had imagined, still glowing, still living in that smooth bubble of ease that seemed to follow her everywhere. Her voice had that familiar sing-song quality, tinged with surprise, but not quite shock. Loretta smiled, but it felt different now, more controlled. "Yeah, it's me." Melanie reached for a hug, her hands soft and manicured, smelling faintly of lavender perfume. As they pulled apart, Melanie tilted her head, studying Loretta with eyes that were more curious than judgmental. "Wow, I can't believe it's been so long. How have you been?" Loretta opened her mouth, but she felt the hesitation. How had she been? There were two answers, the one they expected, and the truth. She decided to ease into it. "I've been good. Just working, living, you know how it goes." Melanie nodded, but there was a flicker of something in her expression. Loretta could tell she was waiting for more. That was the thing about reunions, they weren't really about what you said, but what you didn't. It was in the pauses, the little gaps people would try to fill with their own stories about you. "What about you?" Loretta asked, eager to deflect. "You're a realtor now, right?" Melanie's face lit up. "Oh yes. It's been great, actually. The market's booming around here. We moved back a few years ago when Brad, my husband, got a job at the new law firm in town. 2 kids now, a boy and a girl. It's busy, but, you know, it's a good life." Loretta smiled politely. "That's great, Melanie. I'm happy for you." Before they could dive deeper into small talk, a voice interrupted. "Loretta White." She turned to see Eric Johnson, taller now, broader too. His grin was warm, easy. He reached out, clasping her shoulder in a familiar way, as though they'd never spent all those years apart. "Man, it's been forever. I didn't even know if you'd show up. How are you?" Loretta felt herself relax a little. Eric was always the laid-back one, never the type to make her feel like she had to perform. "I'm doing well. And you? Still running the hardware store?" He laughed, nodding. "Yep, expanded it too. You know, people said we wouldn't last, but it turns out everyone still needs screws and lumber. Who knew, right?" His laughter was infectious, and for a moment, Loretta found herself falling back into the rhythm of things. This felt good, like she was slipping on an old jacket that fit just right. She could handle this. "Do you still live in town?" Eric asked, and there it was, that quiet question that was always on the edge of everyone's mind. What had happened to Loretta White, the girl who was supposed to leave this town far behind? Loretta hesitated, but just as she was about to answer, someone else joined the circle. It was Carmen Diaz, another face from the past, her energy still electric, her voice carrying across the room. "Loretta. I didn't think I'd see you here." The conversation shifted again, laughter bubbling up as old stories were exchanged, about high school, teachers, the pranks they used to pull. Loretta found herself getting lost in it, the weight of their expectations momentarily forgotten. She laughed, genuinely, when Eric recounted the time their science teacher accidentally set a beaker on fire during a chemistry experiment. They laughed even harder when Carmen reminded them how Melanie once tried to skip gym class by faking a sprained ankle. As the group's attention drifted to another conversation, Loretta excused herself. She made her way to the bar, needing a moment to breathe. The bartender handed her a glass of wine, and she took a slow sip, scanning the room again. Everyone was playing their roles perfectly, like they were still performing the parts they'd been assigned in high school. The jocks still gravitated toward one another, their conversations filled with easy bravado. The class clowns were holding court, surrounded by laughter. The quiet ones sat at the edges, observing, just like they always had. And then there was her, somewhere in between. Loretta noticed a group gathered near the back of the room, their eyes darting her way. Whispers floated toward her, just out of reach, but she didn't need to hear the words to know what they were saying. Her skin prickled with the weight of their curiosity, maybe even a hint of disbelief. She took another sip of wine, slower this time. In their eyes, she was still Loretta White, top of her class, the one with all the potential. What they didn't know, what none of them could know, was that life had taken her down a path she hadn't planned for, but one that she had made peace with. Yet here, standing among people who hadn't seen her in years, She felt that old tension creeping back, the way it did whenever someone asked her, "What do you do now?" Loretta could feel the question hovering in the air, unspoken but present. The night was inching toward the moment she had been dreading. She felt it in the casual glances, the questions that danced just out of reach, and the polite curiosity everyone had about the lives they hadn't kept up with. Loretta could see it coming, the inevitable question that had been circling her all evening, waiting for the right moment to land. She kept her distance, floating from conversation to conversation, each encounter a careful negotiation. People asked about her life in general terms, and she answered in kind. It was easier to keep it vague, to talk about the past, to let them fill in the blanks. For the most part, they were happy to oblige, satisfied with their assumptions, their own stories filling in where her silence left off. But it wouldn't last. She found herself standing near the back of the room, her wine glass empty, when Melanie drifted over again, this time with a few others in tow, people she had been close with once, but who now felt like strangers wearing familiar faces. Eric was there, too, his easy grin still in place, and Carmen, always buzzing with energy. They were all there, circling her now like a gentle tide pulling her into their orbit. "So, Loretta," Melanie began, her tone casual but curious, "you never told us what you've been up to these days." Loretta's heart fluttered. She could feel the weight of the moment pressing in on her, the eyes of her former classmates turning toward her in quiet expectation. There was no escape now. The question had finally come. She smiled, but it felt thin. "I've been working at a diner, actually. Out by Route 18. The silence that followed was brief, but it felt longer, stretched out, thick with something unspoken. She saw the flicker in their expressions, the almost imperceptible shifts as they absorbed the words. There was no judgment in their faces, at least, not outright, but there was something else, something like disbelief wrapped in politeness. They tried to hide it, but Loretta had lived long enough to read the subtle language of people's faces. "A diner?" Melanie repeated, her voice softer now, as if she were treading carefully. "Like, you own it?" "No." Loretta's smile tightened, but she held it. "I'm a waitress." The word fell into the space between them, and for a moment, it felt like the air had been sucked out of the room. Carmen, ever the one to fill silence with noise, let out a laugh, too loud, too sudden, like she was trying to bridge the gap between surprise and discomfort. "Oh, that's cool. You must meet all kinds of people out there." "Yeah," Loretta said, her voice steady, but inside, she could feel that old burn rising, something between shame and defiance, though she wasn't sure why. She wasn't ashamed of her life, not really. But standing here, in front of people who had known her when her future had seemed so bright, she couldn't shake the feeling that they were disappointed for her, even if they didn't say it outright. Eric, always one for sincerity, chimed in. "Hey, work is work, right? As long as you're happy, that's what matters." Loretta nodded, but she saw the way he glanced at Melanie, a brief exchange of looks that said more than words ever could. They weren't being cruel, they weren't those kinds of people, but there was something they couldn't quite hide. Disbelief? Pity? Or was it simply surprise that the girl who had once been voted most likely to succeed was now serving burgers and fries to truckers and tourists? She didn't need their words to feel the shift. She could hear the echo of what they weren't saying. Loretta White, the smartest girl in school, a waitress? How could that be? Loretta took a breath, steadying herself. "It's not what I planned, but I like it. It's simple. Keeps me grounded." She paused, her gaze flicking over each of them, challenging them in some quiet way to say something, anything. But they just stood there, polite smiles frozen in place. Carmen was the first to break the tension, her voice bright and quick. "I mean, that's the thing, right? Life never goes the way we plan." She laughed, but the sound was strained, like she was trying to fill the air with something other than awkwardness. "Look at me, I thought I'd be living in New York by now, but I'm still in Cedarwood, teaching at the elementary school." Melanie, sensing the need for a change in tone, added, "And hey, I thought I'd be working at some high-powered law firm, but here I am selling houses. Life just happens, right?" Loretta nodded along, but the words washed over her. She knew what they were trying to do, trying to make her feel like they all understood, like they too had ended up somewhere unexpected. But there was a difference between their stories and hers, a difference that lay in the gap between expectation and reality. For them, the changes had been shifts within the same realm, still professional, still respectable. But for her, it had been a hard swerve, a complete departure from what anyone, including herself, had imagined. She could feel the heat rising in her chest, but she kept her expression calm, her smile unwavering. "Yeah, life has a way of surprising you," she said softly. The conversation drifted on, moving away from her and back to the safer, more comfortable topics of kids, jobs, and vacations. Loretta listened, nodding in the right places, laughing when she was supposed to. But the words were just noise now, a dull hum in the background. In her mind, though, something had shifted. She had said it. It was out there, and now they knew. But as the night wore on, she couldn't help but wonder if they truly saw her, if they understood that being a waitress wasn't something she was ashamed of. It was a life, maybe not the life they had imagined for her, but a life nonetheless. And as the room buzzed with laughter and old memories, she found herself strangely at peace, her heart quieting, her hands no longer trembling. The laughter rose around Loretta, like a tide swelling from all sides, but she drifted above it, floating in her own quiet place. She watched her old classmates, their faces flushed with drinks and the comfort of reminiscing, and she couldn't help but notice how little things had changed. Not in the obvious ways, no, everyone had aged, softened around the edges, the years marked by faint lines and thinning hair, but in their mannerisms, the way they slipped so easily into old dynamics. It was as if no time had passed, as if high school was just a few weeks ago and not 15 years. Loretta leaned against the bar, watching Melanie and Carmen retell stories about prom and spring break. Eric was caught up in some lively debate with a few others about football, the old rivalry still sparking enthusiasm. Around her, everyone was laughing, recounting their glory days as if those 4 years had been the pinnacle of life itself. But Loretta felt detached, as though she were watching from the outside. The night had gone exactly as she had expected. The polite surprise, the careful silences, the barely hidden pity that lingered in the space between their words. It had all played out like a script she had read a dozen times in her head before she even stepped foot in the reunion. And now, standing here, she was aware of just how little any of it mattered. A soft voice pulled her from her thoughts. "Hey." Loretta turned and found herself face to face with Claudia, someone she hadn't spoken to much back in high school. Claudia had been quiet, always sitting in the back of class, often overlooked but always there, like a shadow. Her presence tonight had gone largely unnoticed until now. "Loretta, right?" Claudia asked, her voice a little hesitant. "Yeah," Loretta replied, offering a small smile. "Claudia, right?" Claudia smiled back, a quiet, knowing smile that didn't carry the same forced brightness as the others. "I saw you standing here, and I just thought I'd come say hi." Loretta nodded, grateful for the simplicity of it. "Hi." There was a pause, a comfortable one this time, and then Claudia spoke again, her voice soft but clear. "I heard what you said earlier, about working at the diner." Loretta's chest tightened for a moment, bracing herself for another round of well-meaning but hollow reassurances. But Claudia's eyes held no judgment, no pity. They were calm, understanding in a way that felt genuine, like she saw beyond the surface of things. "That must be hard sometimes," Claudia continued, her tone gentle but direct. "Being back here, doing something so different from what people expected of you." Loretta blinked, surprised by the bluntness, but also relieved. No one else had dared to acknowledge it so plainly. "Yeah," she said quietly. "It is, sometimes. Not the work itself, I don't mind that. But, everything else. The expectations, I guess. Claudia nodded, her gaze steady. I get that. People always think they know what your life should look like, don't they? Loretta let out a small, breathy laugh. Yeah, they do. Claudia smiled again, a small, wry smile. I work at the library now. No one saw that coming either. It's not exactly glamorous, but it suits me. Loretta tilted her head, studying Claudia's face. Do you ever feel like you let people down? Claudia thought for a moment, her eyes drifting over the crowd before landing back on Loretta. Sometimes, she admitted, her voice soft but sure. But I've learned something over the years. People don't actually know what's best for you. They think they do, but they're really just projecting their own fears, their own limits, onto you. Loretta felt those words settle in her chest, something easing inside her. You're right, she murmured. I guess I've been carrying that weight for a long time, trying to live up to everyone's idea of who I should be. Claudia's gaze softened. It's hard to shake that off. Especially when everyone's staring at you, waiting for you to be something. But it's not their life. It's yours. Loretta felt a deep sense of gratitude in that moment, a warmth spreading through her. Here, among all the laughter and the clinking glasses, she found something real, something she hadn't known she needed. It wasn't validation. She wasn't looking for someone to tell her she was doing fine. What she needed, and what Claudia had given her, was the reminder that she had the right to define her own life, on her own terms. I think I've spent so much time trying not to disappoint people, Loretta said quietly, that I forgot what I actually wanted. Claudia nodded, her expression knowing. We all do that, in some way. But there's no shame in taking a different path. What matters is, if it feels right for you. For the first time that evening, Loretta felt the tightness in her chest start to loosen. She had come to the reunion bracing for judgment, preparing herself to face the weight of expectations, but in this quiet conversation with Claudia, she realized something important. The judgment she feared wasn't coming from these people, it was coming from herself. Thanks, Loretta said, her voice filled with quiet sincerity. I didn't know I needed to hear that. Claudia smiled again, a soft, kind smile. We all need to hear it sometimes. As the night carried on around them, Loretta felt lighter, as though a weight had been lifted from her shoulders. Maybe she hadn't become the person they all thought she would be. But she had become someone real, someone grounded in the life she had chosen. And maybe, just maybe, that was enough. As the night wore on, the reunion began to settle into a softer rhythm. The laughter was quieter now, more subdued, as the excitement of the initial greetings gave way to comfortable conversations. People had slipped into smaller groups, some standing by the bar, others sitting at tables, their voices low and familiar. Loretta, after her talk with Claudia, found herself moving through the room with a new ease. The heaviness that had gripped her since the moment she stepped through the doors had lifted, and she no longer felt the need to hide or explain herself. There was a sense of calm, a quiet confidence that came not from proving anything to anyone, but from simply accepting where she was, and who she had become. She spotted Eric across the room, still in the midst of a conversation with a few others. When he caught her eye, he waved her over, his grin as wide and genuine as ever. Loretta hesitated for a moment, then made her way over to him. Hey, Loretta, Eric said as she approached. We were just talking about old times, but I was telling them about that time you and I aced that history project together. You remember that? Loretta smiled, the memory rushing back. She had nearly forgotten how competitive they had been about that project, both of them determined to outshine the rest of the class. Yeah, I remember. We spent weeks on that thing. Eric chuckled. You were so intense about it. I don't think I've ever worked that hard on anything since. He paused, his eyes softening. You know, Loretta, you always were the smartest one in the room. I always figured you'd go on to do something huge. There it was again, that quiet assumption, the expectation that had followed her for so long. But this time, it didn't sting. Loretta smiled, her gaze steady. I guess I did something huge in my own way. Eric tilted his head, his curiosity piqued. Yeah? What do you mean? Loretta took a breath, feeling the words settle inside her before she spoke. I used to think success was about living up to what everyone expected of me. Getting the right job, making the right moves. But the older I get, the more I realize that success looks different for everyone. She glanced around the room, her eyes lingering on the faces of her former classmates. Some people build careers, raise families, stay in one place, and that's their success. But for me, success has been about finding peace with where I am. Working at the diner, it's simple, yeah, but I like it. I get to talk to people, hear their stories, and live a life that's real. I'm not chasing something that doesn't fit me anymore. Eric listened quietly, his brow furrowed, but not in confusion, more in reflection. He nodded slowly, as if turning her words over in his mind. I get that, he said finally. It's easy to forget that success isn't a one-size-fits-all thing. Loretta smiled, grateful that he understood. Exactly. I used to worry that I wasn't living up to what everyone thought I should be. But now, I think maybe the only person I really need to impress is myself. Eric looked at her for a long moment, then raised his glass. To that, he said with a grin. I think we could all stand to learn a little from that. Loretta laughed, the sound light and genuine. She clinked her glass against his, and for the first time that evening, she felt completely at ease. The weight of expectation had been lifted, and she no longer felt the need to explain herself. This was her life, and it was enough. As the night wore on, people began to gather their things, preparing to leave. There were more hugs, more exchanges of phone numbers and promises to keep in touch, though everyone knew that most of those promises would go unfulfilled. Loretta said her goodbyes, but this time, it felt different. The awkwardness of earlier had melted away, replaced by a sense of peace she hadn't expected. As she stepped outside into the cool night air, she paused, taking a moment to look up at the sky. The stars were faint, but visible, scattered across the dark canvas like distant possibilities. She breathed in deeply, letting the air fill her lungs, and for the first time in a long time, she felt light. Loretta walked slowly to her car, her heels clicking softly against the pavement. She glanced back at the hall one last time, the golden light spilling out from the windows, the muffled sounds of laughter and conversation still drifting into the night. She smiled to herself, not with any bitterness or regret, but with quiet understanding. Life had not turned out the way she, or anyone else, had imagined. But maybe that was the point. Maybe success wasn't about meeting expectations, but about letting go of them. Maybe it was about finding contentment in the choices you made, no matter how small they seemed to others. Loretta slid into the driver's seat of her car, the leather warm beneath her. She sat there for a moment, the engine quiet, her hands resting gently on the steering wheel. She wasn't in a rush to leave, not anymore. She was in no rush for anything. For the first time in a long time, she felt free, not from the weight of expectations, but from the need to live up to them. She had her own life, and it was hers to shape, to define, to live as she saw fit. With a soft smile still playing at the corners of her mouth, Loretta turned the key in the ignition. The engine hummed to life, and as she pulled out onto the road, she felt a deep, quiet joy settle inside her. She didn't need to be the top student anymore. She didn't need to be anything other than who she was. And for Loretta White, that was enough.